this layout was once again imagined with GPT Image 2.0. After a first successful experiment, I wanted to create a second landing page using only image references generated by GPT Image 2.0. So this time, I generated a full set of 7 section references. And once again, what surprised me is that the images didn't really have that generic AI look. They actually felt like a real landing page section. The structure made sense, the visual direction was strong, and the page already felt something that could be turned into a functional website. So if you're curious about the full workflow behind this process, last week I published a 35-minute video where I explained everything behind the scenes. I show how I generated the image references, how I used them as visual direction, and how I polished the final landing page inside Aura. So the same workflow can absolutely be applied to the layout I'm showing you in this video. But this time, I wanted to test something new. A model family I haven't really used much since I've started building these landing pages. Claude, more specifically, Claude Opus 4.8. Opus 4.8 was released this week, so I was curious to see if it was actually good for UI design. So I decided to test it on the same second layout you saw in the intro. Inside Aura, which is one of the main tools I use to build and polish my landing pages, the new model was already available. So I started by testing it on the hero section, but the workflow was a little bit different from what I usually do with GPT 5.5 Thinking. With GPT 5.5, my usual process is to upload the HTML file, explain the changes I want, iterate directly on the code, copy the updated version, and replace it inside Aura. That gives me a very controlled workflow. But since I don't currently have an active Anthropic subscription, I couldn't use Claude the exact same way at first. So for the first test, I tried to reproduce the hero section mostly through prompting. And this is the result I got. And honestly, after the first iteration, I was not really impressed. The overall structure was there. You can tell the model understood the basic layout, but visually, the result felt pretty average. It didn't have the premium finish, the spacing, the hierarchy, or the level of polish I was able to reach with GPT 5.5. And this is where UI design with prompt can become frustrating. If you're only describing changes through text, it can be hard to guide the model toward a very specific polished result, especially if the first version is already slightly off. But to be fair, this was not a perfect comparison because the workflow was not the same. With GPT 5.5, I usually work directly with the HTML. With Claude, in this first attempt, I was mostly relying on prompt-based iteration. So I decided to make the test more fair. Instead of only testing Claude inside the builder, I paired Aura with Claude Opus 4.8 in a separate workflow. This way, I could upload the HTML file, ask Claude to improve the section, copy the updated code, and replace it back inside Aura. Basically, the same workflow I normally use with GPT 5.5 Thinking, and that's where the real comparison begins. Can Claude Opus 4.8 actually compete with GPT 5.5 Thinking when it comes to polishing UI? So let's find out. So to create the first iteration of the hero section, I started very simply. I uploaded the hero image reference inside Aura and used a prompt like recreate this layout as accurately as possible, keep the same style, vibe, and color palette. And at this stage, I'm not expecting the result to be perfect. The goal is just to generate a strong first version that gives us the structure. The real work happens after during the polishing phase. So once Aura generates the page, we can export the HTML file. And now I have the Claude app side by side with my browser. Usually with my GPT 5.5 workflow, I upload the HTML file, explain the changes I want, let the model return the updated code, and then I copy and paste that code back into Aura using code mode. And that works very well. But with Claude, there's another option, Claude Code. Claude Code is basically a coding workspace where Claude can read, edit, and manage files directly inside a project folder. So instead of only chatting with the model and copying code back and forth, you can let Claude work directly with your HTML file. And for this kind of UI iteration workflow, that can be very powerful. So first, I'm going to show you the method where we start from scratch. So inside the Claude app, on the main interface, on the left top corner, you'll see different options like chat, co-work, and code. For this workflow, I'm going to select code. And just to be clear, this is my first time using Claude Code, so I'll show you just the basic workflow and how it can be used as a UI builder. So we click on New Session, then Claude asks us to select a folder because it needs access to a project folder where it can read, create, and store files. For this test, I'll create a simple folder called UI Testing. Now I'll upload the hero reference image and paste the same prompt I used earlier in Aura. And at this point, I'm not exactly sure what Claude will generate because I didn't give it a very detailed technical prompt. So it could create an HTML file, a React project, or maybe something else. So let's see what happens. And this is where you can start to see that Claude Code can almost work like an AI builder. If you already have access to it, you can technically generate a design directly inside Claude Code instead of starting from another builder. After the first iteration, I noticed that it generated the layout in HTML, which is perfect for this test because all my landing pages are currently built as HTML files. So that's the first method. You can start with a reference image, just ask Claude Code to recreate the layout, and it will generate the first version from scratch. Now let's look at the second method. This one is closer to the workflow I actually want to test. This time I created a proper folder for the design project. I called it Aurelia AI Travel. Then I moved the HTML file that I exported from Aura into that folder. After that, I opened an existing Claude Code session connected to that project. And before doing anything serious, I asked a very simple question. Can you read this file? Claude replied that it could read the HTML file, so that's already a good start. From here, I can begin iterating on the design using plain language, and this is where the workflow becomes interesting because I don't need to copy and paste code between tools anymore. The HTML file is already inside the Claude Code project folder. So I can simply describe the changes I want, and Claude can update the actual file directly in real time. At this point in the video, I already started doing a few iterations on the hero section. So for the purpose of this demo, I also asked Claude Code to create a vision history after each major changes. So basically after each of my message. That way it becomes easier to show what's changed from one iteration to the next. But if you're just working on your own project, you don't need to do that. And one thing I noticed is that the computer started to feel a little bit slower after a while. My guess is that because I was storing multiple versions of the code, the file became larger and heavier than it needed to be. So for a real project, I would probably keep the version history cleaner. Now here we can see the first iteration. And personally, I like to work in smaller pieces. I don't like asking the AI to fix too many things at once because when the request is too broad, the model can easily miss details or change things that were already working. So instead, I prefer to make smaller, focused changes. For example, in the next message, I asked Claude Code to slightly redesign the navigation and center the company name. After that, I asked it to realign the three floating cards and make sure they all had the same width. And this is where Claude Code feels very different from my usual GPT workflow. Instead of writing everything manually, copying the updated code, pasting it into Aura, checking the result, and repeating the process, I can simply use dictation. I can speak naturally, explain what needs to change, and Claude updates that file directly. Of course, you still need to be clear. If your instructions are vague, the model can still misunderstand what you want, but when you explain the changes properly, this workflow removes a lot of friction. There is less copy paste, less back and forth, and the iteration loops feels faster. So on workflow alone, I would give this point to Claude Code. But workflow is only one part of the test. The real question is, how good is Claude Opus 4.8 at polishing the details? because generating a layout is one thing, but making it feel premium is another. So now let's look at the actual design quality. Here I've made all the changes I needed for this test. Just for testing purposes, I added 5 sections to the page. 3 of them were sections where I actually took the time to polish the details. So the goal here was not to recreate the full landing page perfectly or to make it identical to the versions you saw in the demo. The goal was simply to test the workflow. Can Claude Code help me move faster? And more importantly, is Claude Opus 4.8 actually worth using for UI design? So now let's continue by looking at the changes made to the hero section. At this stage, the main layout is already pretty close. The structure works, the left content is in the right place, the floating cards are aligned better, and the overall composition is there. So from here, most of the work is about fixing smaller details. Things like the font size of the small eyebrow title, the color of the button, the spacing between the elements, and adding more detail to the 3 items underneath the CTA. On the right side, we were also missing the vertical line that connects all the dots inside the 7-day escape card. So after a few iterations, you can see that the hero section already looks much better. The left side is good, still not perfect to my taste yet, but definitely improved. And on the 7-day escape card, we added the missing vertical line, improved spacing, and gave the card a little bit more structure. But this is where I started to notice something important. Getting that premium look is not just about placing the elements correctly. The layout can be accurate, but still feel a bit flat. And if you don't know how to describe the premium finish clearly, it can be difficult to get the model to push the design further, especially if you're not giving it a strong visual system, a design reference, or something like a design.md file. In this case, I didn't use a design.md file on purpose because on my original layout, I didn't use one, so I wanted to be fair for both tests. I also wanted to rely only on the image reference and see how far the model can take it by itself. Another simple way to improve the section is by replacing the generic placeholder images. And this is one part where Claude Code is actually very useful. So if you store your images inside the project folder, Claude can access them and insert them directly into the HTML file. So here I replaced 3 images, the main background image, the image inside the 7-day escape card, and the map inside the journey card. I also decided to remove the extra padding on the image area, especially on the top, bottom, and left. So now let's compare the result. At this point, the layout is mostly reproduced. The structure is there, the content is there, the cards are in the right place, the images are replaced, but I still had a little bit of trouble getting the overlay intensity exactly right on the background image. And this is where the difference becomes more obvious. Now let's compare it to the hero section I created with GPT 5.5 Thinking. Right away, you can see that it's the same layout, same content, same image direction, same overall structure, but visually, the GPT 5.5 version feels more premium immediately. The cards have more depth, the buttons feel more refined, the font size feels more intentional, the font weights are better balanced, the shadows are more subtle, the backdrop blur feels cleaner, and the overall hierarchy feels more polished. And believe it or not, all of those small details were handled by GPT 5.5 Thinking. I didn't give it a magic prompt, I didn't use a design.md file, and I didn't provide any extra premium UI reference. The workflow was very similar to what I did with Opus 4.8. Most of the changes were about refining the layout structure, adjusting spacing, improving alignment, and polishing the section step by step. But somehow, GPT 5.5 was better at understanding what makes a landing page feels premium. And this is something I already noticed across the 2 different landing pages using the same workflow. Both landing pages started from GPT Image 2.0 references, and both time GPT 5.5 was able to capture the small UI details that elevates the final result. So if you watch my previous video, You probably saw this in the polishing phase. It's not one big dramatic change, it's a lot of small decision, the depth of the cards, the softness of the shadows, the contrast between surfaces, the subtle backdrop blur, the button treatment, the spacing, the balance between text and visuals. Those details are what takes a page from good to premium. And for the specific part of the test, GPT 5.5 Thinking wins very clearly. Claude Code wins on workflow convenience, but when it comes to polishing the visual details and making the UI feel premium, GPT 5.5 is still ahead. Now let's move on to the second section. So here is the image reference. The layout is actually pretty nice. It's well structured, visually balanced, and at the same time, not too complex to reproduce. So let's see how Claude Opus 4.8 handles it. And here's the first iteration. Honestly, the model almost nailed it. The main structure is very close to the reference. The composition is there. The spacing is mostly working. And overall, it already feels like the section is heading in the right direction. There are just a few small details missing. For example, we're missing the vertical dividers between the icons and the text. We're also missing the horizontal divider between the quotes, and some of the text is wrapping onto two lines, so we just need to increase the width slightly. And at the bottom right, we need to replace the visual element with an actual image. On my original landing page, I wanted this second section to sit inside a container, almost like a postcard, something that visually disconnect this section from the hero while still feeling connected to the same design system. So by adding a container, soft shadows, and a little bit of depth, the sections start to feel more intentional. For this section, the polishing was pretty easy. It didn't need a lot of fixes or major structural changes. And here is the polished version. Now all the missing elements are there, the dividers are in place, and the text balance inside the preference card feels much better. And I also replaced the bottom right visual with a stamp image, which fits nicely with the travel concept. So overall, section 2 was a good result for Claude Opus 2.8. Now let's move on to the third section. And this one is another beautiful layout. Obviously, in the image reference, we can see that the section includes the navigation at the top, but the AI will understand that it doesn't need to include the navigation again because it already exists in the page. So I was curious to see how this one would go because on my original landing page, GPT 5.5 actually had some trouble aligning the section exactly like the image reference. I had to do multiple iterations before I was satisfied. So here's the first iteration from Claude. And one thing I forgot to mention is that I added all my image references inside the project folder. So when I'm ready to move on to the next section, I don't need to manually upload the reference image again. I can simply ask Claude Code to continue and add a new section using the correct reference image. And because the images are already stored inside the folder, it understands what to use. It can go find the image by itself and generate the first version from there. So here is the result. And honestly, I was impressed with what it achieved on the first try. The layout is almost spot on, the overall structure is very close to the reference, the hierarchy makes sense, the card placement is strong, and the section already feels very usable. There are still some things to fix. The sixth item underneath the subtitle needs to stay on one line, and we also need to add some alpha masking on the left and right side of the row, so it feels more polished. Then we need to replace the placeholder visuals with the actual beautiful images. And the two top cards should feel more consistent with the three cards at the bottom. But overall, as a first iteration, this is a very strong result. And by the way, the images you see in this section are also part of the GPT Image 2.0 workflow. When GPT Image generated the section references, it didn't just create a layout, it also imagined beautiful images inside the design. And what I found interesting is that those images were not random. They actually matched the mood, the color palette, and the vibe of the landing page very well. So instead of asking myself what kind of images I should use to fill the page, I used the image reference as the visual direction. From each section reference, I asked GPT Image to extract the images individually without any text or UI elements. That way, I could download them, save them, and reuse them inside the final HTML page. So now, instead of using generic placeholder images, the landing page has visuals that already feels professional and aligned with the concept. And that alone adds another layer of premium quality to the design. So for the third section, Claude Opus 4.8 also did a good job. The structure was surprisingly accurate, but compared to the GPT 5.5 version, I still feel like it lacks a bit of polish in how the text content is organized, balanced, and visually refined. Now let's move on to section 4. For this one, I decided not to continue polishing this section, and the reason is simple. The first iteration was too far from the original image reference. This layout is more complex. It has more structure, more layered element, and more visual organization to get right. So trying to fix everything only through dictation would probably require a lot of work, a lot of trial and error, and many small corrections. And what's interesting is that when I created this same section with GPT 5.5, it almost nailed the structure on the first iteration. So this is where the comparison becomes a bit strange. For section 3, GPT 5.5 had more trouble with the layout, while Claude Opus 4.8 got very close on the first try. But for section 4, GPT 5.5 had no major issue, while Claude was completely off. So it's not as simple as saying one model is always better than the other. I guess it depends on the section, it depends on the complexity, and it also depends on how the model interprets the reference image. Then I decided to test section 5, and here again, if we compare it to the original reference, the result is also quite far from what I wanted. To be fair, I remember that GPT 5.5 also had some trouble with the first iteration of this section. So after doing this experiment, I honestly have nothing bad to say about Claude Code or Claude Opus 4.8. The workflow is smart, the file access is very useful, and the ability to speak naturally and let the model update the HTML file directly and avoid copying the code back and forth is definitely powerful. But if I had to choose between the two workflows today, I would still continue with my actual GPT 5.5 thinking workflow. And the reason is simple. Based on this layout alone, it felt easier to achieve that premium look with GPT 5.5. And for landing pages, that matters a lot because a landing page can have the right structure, the right content, and the right images. But if the small details are not polished, it still doesn't fully stand out. All of those small decisions are what make the difference between a decent AI generated page and something that feels premium. Now, to be fair, Claude Code is extremely smart, and I'm sure it can do a lot of great things, especially if you're coding the full landing page directly inside it. Because once the page is created, you can continue adding more functionality, more advanced feature, and potentially turn it into a more complete website. So on the coding side, I definitely understand why people love Claude. The Claude models are known for being strong at code, and this workflow makes a lot of sense if you want the AI to work directly inside your project. But while I was iterating inside Claude Code, there was one thing I didn't like as much. I didn't feel I had the same level of manual control. In my usual workflow, when GPT 5.5 gives me the updated code, I just copy and paste it into Aura through code mode. And if I understand exactly which element I want to edit myself, I can just go into the HTML and change it manually. That gives me more control. For example, something as simple as the overlay intensity on the hero image. With plain language, Opus 4.8 had some trouble getting the intensity exactly where I want it. But inside Aura, I can just go into code mode, find the overlay layer, and adjust the opacity or brightness myself. That kind of manual control is still important to me. So Overall, I would say that Claude Opus 4.8 is pretty good at generating layouts accurately. In some section, it was actually very impressive, but it was a bit harder to push the design to the next level of polish, at least with the way I tested it here. That doesn't mean Claude can create beautiful landing pages. I'm pretty sure if I spent more time with the model, learned its pattern, and understood the best way to prompt it, I would probably get much better result. And if I gave it a strong design.md file, I would probably get much closer to the premium visual direction I'm looking for. Claude already has its own design focused feature called Claude Design. I didn't have time to test it yet, but from what I understand, it's more focused on creating design outputs using Anthropic model. So maybe with that workflow, the result could be very different. That could be an interesting test for another video. But for now, I'll stick with my current workflow. Not because Claude is bad, but just because I spend more time with GPT 5.5 thinking. I understand how it reacts. I know how to guide it. And right now, it helps me reach the kind of polished result I'm looking for faster. So my final takeaway is this. Claude Code wins on workflow convenience. GPT 5.5 Thinking still wins for premium UI polish, at least for this specific landing page experiment. And honestly, both workflow are powerful. It just depends on what you care about more. If you want direct file control and a coding first workflow, Claude Code is very interesting. But if your main goal is just to push a landing page toward a premium visual result, I still feel more confident using GPT 5.5 Thinking. So I hope you enjoyed this comparison. If you did, make sure to leave a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video.